Listen, it's no secret. Bayonetta 3 has left the series and the fans in a perplexing spot. Yeah, every day is a new argument to be had. Was Jeanne's death justified? Did everyone die, or were they revived? Why didn't Rodon or Loki help keep out the threat if it was so large? Where was Baldur? Would Bayonetta's variants really get hit from behind like that? Why doesn't Bayonetta speak much? Is her new voice even good? Why didn't her romance with Luca get explored more? Is Viola going to be the new Bayonetta? Is Viola worthy of being the new Bayonetta? Why did Singularity even go on his crusade in the first place? The list goes on, and depending on who you ask, you'll either hear that the trilogy ended on an extremely high note, or that it petered out with a pitiful whimper. This kind of divide in an established fan base is rarely seen. Really, I can only think of Pokemon as another example of people being this divided. But what if I told you that was on purpose? What if Bayonetta's future was purposely left vague so that Platinum Games could evaluate the best course of action moving forward? And what if, when all the possibilities are overlaid, one path stands out the clearest for where the series should go? Platinum Games, I hope you're watching. Roll the intro. Bayonetta 3 already vaguely follows a familiar template set up by another series. That series is Devil May Cry. And it makes sense. After all, many alumni who worked on the original DMC now work at Platinum Games. And I imagine the story structure we've seen for Devil May Cry is reminiscent to the original team's vision. So, with Bayonetta being the spiritual successor forged by many of the same developers, it seems Platinum Games is taking their own crack at the same story structure. An all-powerful offspring of two opposing forces, a rival who comes close to matching you in combat, a clumsy understudy, and a passing of the torch to said understudy. Some gameplay elements translate as well. A super ridiculous weapon made from a method of transportation, a weapon made from an instrument, a half-demon transformation, Michael Jackson references. Sure, okay, while Bayonetta 1 and 2 mostly paved their own story and gameplay quirks to stand outside of Devil May Cry's shadow, it's clear that Bayonetta 3 seemed determined to do exactly what Devil May Cry 5 did, but better. And honestly, this produced mixed results. And I don't think that's a good thing. Opinion time, yeah. I think that Platinum Games is poisoning their own well by trying to chase after Devil May Cry. Reception to Bayonetta 1 and 2 was universally positive, but Bayonetta 3 only managed to split opinion. Platinum Games needs to realize something. The deed is done, guys. Devil May Cry was able to pump out 5 games before Bayonetta even released its third. That's 5 games of journeying with Dante. That's 5 games to show us Dante's growth as a character. That's 2 games to introduce us to a successor. A successor that earned that torch by the end of the 5th game because the writers crafted a satisfying arc with growth and personal storytelling. That included Dante. Oh, and Dante didn't have to die to pass the torch. So, Johnny, you're talking mad shit. And yeah, I am. I bet you think you know where Platinum Games is going with this franchise, don't you? Yeah, I bet you do. Well, newsflash. Platinum doesn't even know where this franchise is going. Yeah, I said it. Platinum Games has no clue what the to do with this series. The original creator left the company. Everyone is split on how they feel about Bayonetta 3, but oh wait! It sold 1 million copies pretty much on release. So close yet so far, because guess what the happened after that? Sales halted almost entirely 3 months in because, unlike the first 2 games, word of mouth was not overwhelmingly positive. Old fans are leaving the series because of 3's ending. Almost no one bought Origins even though it was a great game. Probably because who wants to witness an origin story of a character who died? Besides me. People who could have been new fans are scared to give the series a go because of the negative side of the reception for Bayonetta 3. The series is in such a weird spot right now, and this is a make or break moment for Platinum Games. But this doesn't have to be the end. If any of you have seen my channel before, you've probably viewed a few of my videos explaining how Platinum Games actually created an extremely vague ending that currently leaves almost everything up to interpretation. It's actually entirely possible that everyone who died was revived. It's entirely possible Jeanne got stabbed on purpose. It's entirely possible Luca saved Cereza from dying at the end. It's entirely possible that Viola isn't going to be the new protagonist moving forward. And this ending was left so vague precisely because of what I mentioned earlier. Platinum Games has no idea what to do next. They're waiting, they're watching, they're witnessing trends, and honestly, I know exactly which trend they should follow. Spoiler alert, it's not Devil May Cry. No, there's a series out there that has found so much more mainstream success because of some major runbacks and shifts it made at a pivotal moment in its lifespan. The decisions this series made were so successful that the games are now talked about regularly in video game discourse and have earned even more critical acclaim than they ever did before they did these changes. And honestly, the pivotal moment this other series made these shifts at was a very similar moment to Bayonetta's current situation. The two series really do have a lot in common. You may have already guessed what I'm talking about by now. The series Bayonetta should switch its gears to outlining is the God of War series. Just like with Bayonetta 3, Kratos supposedly died at the end of God of War 3. Just like the Bayonetta series, God of War was a hack and slash franchise. Just like Bayonetta, Kratos is an all-powerful weapon of mass destruction that can completely reshape the world they inhabit. And just like how God of War had a major shift from exploring Greek mythology to exploring Norse mythology, Bayonetta seems to be switching from its mix of Norse mythology and Western Christianity to European folklore and fairy tales for its main lore. There are more similarities between the series that we'll get into, but for now, let's tackle how Bayonetta can handle the concepts expertly managed by God of War so that it too can find similar levels of success. For starters, Bayonetta needs to remain the protagonist. Just like with Kratos, we have a supremely unique character not found in any other media. Kratos was impactful and forged a recognizable identity removed from other protagonists because he was, at his core, an anti-hero. The man knew no bounds in his revenge. He ravaged the entirety of Greece, killing every single inhabitant along the way in his quest with no remorse. His design even reflects the blood and ash of his loved ones he's avenging. There's no other character like Kratos in gaming, at least not in any mainstream games. Now, let's look at Bayonetta versus her supposed heir to the title, Viola. Like Kratos, Bayonetta has also forged a recognizable identity far removed from any other game protagonist we've ever seen. She's a hyper-feminine, supremely confident character who owns herself and her sexuality in a way that subverts the player's expectations at every toss and turn. Her designs and personality scream regality and poise, yet also sexy and fierce. Intelligence and class, but also adventure and wit. No other character like Bayonetta exists in gaming, at least not in mainstream games. Which Bayonetta is now mainstream with its 1 million sales within 3 months for Bayonetta 3, as well as her inclusion in the Super Smash Bros. Series. To make Viola the new protagonist of the series would be a huge mistake, plain and simple. Not only because the name of Bayonetta has now become mainstream and synonymous with Cereza, but also because Viola lacks any sort of uniqueness. Let's look at her attributes. Viola is a clumsy nerd who refuses to let anyone know she doesn't have the situation handled. She also wants everyone to know her name, and she'll scream it at the top of her lungs. Sound familiar? Yep. She's literally exactly the same as every shonen protagonist ever. And just like those protagonists, sure, yeah, she has some great power locked up deep inside her. But oh my god, how many times have we tread this story over and over by now? And how many times do I have to say, no one's gonna do it better than Naruto did anyways, so they may as well just stop trying. It's honestly just frustrating and redundant at this point. Not only that, but Viola's inner power is that she's a furry. Look, I have nothing against furries, and I'm sure furries out there love Viola, but once again, we've seen the equivalent to this in other media many times, including, as I've mentioned, Naruto with the nine-tailed fox demon. And again, it was done better there. I'm not even saying Viola is a bad character. She's just a bad protagonist. Her best role on screen is honestly to give contrast to the sublime Bayonetta. Their interactions are some of the best parts in 3, and honestly, they should have had more. That's where Bayonetta 4 comes in, because I feel like Viola is actually very comparable to Atreus in regards to how she should interact with the narrative and Cereza. In God of War, we once again took control of Kratos, contrary to what many thought thanks to the ending of God of War 3. We find out that he's relocated to Scandinavia and is raising, of all things, a son he had after the events of the trilogy. Enter Atreus, a young boy who has the innate power of a furry and a demigod thanks to his parents. Again, a clear comparison to Viola. God of War 4 then goes on to dive into the working relationship between father and son and one of the most subversive stories ever told in gaming. The dynamic between the two characters is like none I've seen. An anti-hero raising his child in a cold attempt to try not to let him become a villain like he was? It's interesting stuff, and the story is no slouch in exploring every consequence that entails. The gameplay has also seen a dramatic shift. We go from outlandishly large hack and slash spectacle to a much tighter, dynamic, and intimate approach to plowing through enemies. Every kill matters more because it also matters more to the story. Enemies aren't simply fodder this time. Each one feeds into the narrative, and their demise leads to further consequences. This is a radical 180 from the God of War trilogy, but it's one that's welcome because it's the central theme of the game. That there are consequences for your actions. This mature theming is a great way for the series to grow with its audience, to become a mature game in a different way than it was labeled mature before. Instead of blood and guts, we have emotion and thought provocation. It's a glorious evolution. Bayonetta 3 had me excited pre-release because I really did think, based on the trailers, that we were going to have a heartfelt story of a witch and her daughter trying to stop the end of the world. But instead, we got a dislocated adventure where the two are split apart for the entire ride and neither of them grows as a result. It was the definition of a wasted scenario. With Bayonetta 4, we should see the chance to rectify that. We need to see Bayonetta properly mentor Viola and be present for her. When it comes to the story, I do believe we should finally explore their dynamic and make it the central focus of the narrative. And similarly to God of War, this joint arc should take several games for us to witness. Obviously, I don't want PlatinumGames to copy exactly what God of War did with its story. What would be the point of Bayonetta being a separate series if it does exactly the same things as the other? But what I do think it should do is use what God of War has accomplished as a template. The story arc between Cereza and Viola can have its own twists and turns. The themes can and should be entirely different. Perhaps focus the story on a new arc that spans an entire new trilogy, where Bayonetta and Viola try to liberate the Trinity of Realities from their constant war with each other. Maybe something with the fairies can tie in as relevance. Because personally, I like the fairies, and I think they're really interesting additions to the Bayonetta lore. They exist outside of the Trinity of Realities, yet embedded themselves into the realm of chaos. I want to explore that. I want to explore Lucan. I want to explore Morgana. Perhaps see Morgana and Rosa interact somehow. See Lucan and Baldur interact. The possibilities are endless. I mean, this is a series where magic exists. Anything is possible. So, let's make the coolest ideas we have possible while making sure we give justice to beloved characters. There's no point in making new characters when we haven't even fleshed out our existing ones. Having fan favorites return and grow more is a key ingredient to longevity for any series. Since Bayonetta and God of War are two different franchises, they should also explore different themes and stories, as I've mentioned. So, let's take a quick look at how the two series differ. Let's start with the kids. For one, unlike Atreus, Viola doesn't need a coming-of-age arc. She's already lived through one by experiencing heartache and even witnessing the eradication of her entire universe at one point. No, what Viola lacks instead is a power arc. Even in Bayonetta 3, when we see her activate her fairy powers, it was all for nothing since she never uses it again in moments we needed it. This was especially annoying to witness in the final battle against Singularity, where her getting knocked out actually gets Cereza killed. Maybe if she had transformed, she could have actually done something useful. Perhaps we see her dealing with that inner turmoil and guilt in Bayonetta 4. As for Bayonetta herself, while she and Kratos both supposedly died at the end of their third games, Bayonetta doesn't necessarily have any guilt for her actions that she needs to address. I'd say Cereza's guilt would stem more from inactions on her part, not her actions. Let's assume Bayonetta 3's vague ending was canonically confirmed to have not restored the multiverses. Perhaps Bayonetta would feel she didn't do enough to save the multiverse in time. She wasn't able to stop Jeanne from being killed. She couldn't be around for her daughter during a pivotal time. She might even need to acknowledge that she tried to do too much on her own and didn't focus enough on teamwork. That could very well be a worthwhile path for the story to take if we see her try to rectify all of that somehow. Conversely, if all the universes were restored, which seems to be what the story implied more anyway, perhaps a new threat worthy of an entire new trilogy can just manage to bring something from Cereza's past up to haunt her, and we see her and Viola deal with that together. We could even tie this into my proposition earlier of having a story where Bayonetta and Viola try to end war between the Trinity of Realities. I really am just spitballing here, so if you have any better ideas, please let me know down in the comments and we'll talk about it there. Now for the gameplay. I do believe that 3 was onto something when it introduced several playable characters with different control structures. Matter of fact, I think they only took this far enough with Jeanne. But I have an even better way Platinum Games can create a divide between playable characters while keeping a cohesive control scheme, keeping the players engaged, not needing to sacrifice pacing, and not even need to entirely rid themselves of Bayonetta's signature hack-and-slash combat. Bayonetta 3 had perhaps the most sublime combat in the trilogy. Demon Slave was the perfect mechanic to evolve the series and really bring what we saw in cutscenes into gameplay. I don't think Platinum Games should get rid of this impressive feat. Bayonetta herself should still do what she does best: fast-paced, high-octane fighting. But the series should move to a more adventure-based structure, similarly to what God of War 4 and 5 did. If we want to look at one of Platinum Games' own works that already does this as a shining example, we can look to Nier Automata for comparison. It featured an expansive overworld with an emotionally driven story that unlocks you a chapter select by the end of the game, while still leaving plenty of time for hack-and-slash combat throughout. Specific side quests and collectibles were locked to certain parts of the story, so when you go into the chapter select, you can take them on there. And no matter how much you interact with the chapter select, you still have your general progress carried over from when you had beaten the game. Now, I'm not saying Bayonetta needs to become open world, but it does need to place more importance and focus to the world it's placing us in. Then, when it comes time to do combat with Bayonetta, she can use her fast-paced fighting skills on the fly, and if the fight takes place in more open areas, she can use her demons too. Matter of fact, we could reserve more open fields for fighting specifically with Bayonetta, as opposed to Viola. So then, where does Viola fit into this? Personally, I think we should also get to control Viola, but make her combat segments more tight and decision-based. Viola would be a character fighting for her life in close quarters, not fighting for style points. I imagine the camera being closer to her, similar to games like God of War, Sekiro, and HellBlade. The enemies she fights will be more meticulous, so the player will need to be as well. What Viola could offer for gameplay is divine swordplay that complements Bayonetta's combat rather than being a worse version of it like it was in 3. Also, I'd love the two characters to be mostly present around each other, but switch to these Viola segments when the two accidentally or intentionally separate at times. Yet, they always meet back up to work together again. Now, those of you watching may think I'm crazy for coming up with these ideas, but honestly, if you feel that way, by all means, just let me know some better ideas down in the comments. You're also a super cool person if you leave a thumbs up and subscribe before moving on to other videos of mine. And the absolute coolest people are the ones who can support me on Patreon. Links right in front of you. I've been Johto Johnny. Love you guys. Enjoy.